Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this conference and for opting to listen to this presentation. My name is Sarah Minogue and I submitted my Master's of Psychological Science thesis this year. My thesis used data collected from within the PolRom project database in Ireland. My paper is titled Níl Aon Cinnicis Mar de Cinnicis Féin: Insights from an NGO on Sustainable Social Change in Intergroup Contexts of Irish Traveller Discrimination in Ireland, which I hope to explain more in this presentation. The interesting quote in the title is an adaptation of a well-known Irish phrase, meaning there's no home like your own home, so in English, there's no place like home. The adapted phrase in the title now reads, there's no racism like your own racism, which I felt encompassed a lot of the interesting insights which we found from the data. Before I get ahead of myself, I would just like to mention what the aim and research question of the thesis was. The aim of this paper is to explore the barriers and facilitators of intercultural competence and how best to create sustainable social change in intergroup contexts of discrimination, with a particular focus on Irish travellers in Ireland. In my thesis, I illustrate a short history and context of Irish travellers in Ireland, so I'd like to do that for you now. Irish travellers are a cultural group of people that date back thousands of years in Ireland. Historically, Irish travellers were known to be nomadic people who would move and work around the country. They were famous storytellers with their own language, now in modern times referred to as cant. As long ago as 10,000 years, some nomadic people opted to settle and live in one place, while Irish travellers continued to live traditionally. Over time, these two groups of Irish people have been known as Irish settled people and Irish travellers. Irish travellers are generally marginalised, and shame is often assigned to their culture by the majority of Irish settlers. The overarching tension between Irish travellers and Irish settled people have had significant consequences for Irish travellers. Since settled people are the dominant group in Ireland, Irish travellers' rights and freedoms have been violated and restricted for a very long time. This has resulted in Irish travellers being ostracised and criticised by dominant Irish society. Due to this institutionalised racism, Irish travellers fare badly on all indicators of equality, with lower outcomes in education, a huge health gap, and a shocking 80% unemployment rate. This further enforces Irish travellers to live segregated from general Irish society, where over 50% of Irish travellers experience daily discrimination, prejudice, threats, violence, and ignorance from settled people. The data that is analysed in this study was collected within a project called the PolRom Toolkit. The toolkit, as you know, is a multinational research collaboration between social psychologists in 5 European countries that are committed to helping policymakers and practitioners effectively combat anti-Gypsyism in Europe. The toolkit is a resource of evidence-based research and information on effective interventions through a social psychology framework that aim to reduce Roma discrimination, expression of hate and segregation towards Roma, and to promote efforts of inclusion. The data collection method in my thesis was a focus group, and the aim of the focus group was to assess how NGOs try to improve intergroup relations and encourage positive social change for marginalised communities in Ireland. The participating NGO in this study is the Donegal Travellers Project. It was one of the longest established and largest locally based community development organisation dedicated to working for and with the traveller community. It was established by travellers and members of the settled community in Donegal. For over 20 years, the organisation has supported travellers to articulate their identity, to organise collectively, and to work towards the realisation of their rights. Their aim is to develop inclusion and positive relationships between Black, minority, and ethnic communities, including travellers and Roma. 5 participants from the Donegal Travellers Project were contacted, and they were members from 4 different projects in that organisation, all of which focused on different minority communities. The transcription from the focus group was analysed using Braun and Clark's thematic analysis method. According to Braun and Clark, thematic analysis is a method which allows for the identification, analysis, and reporting of patterns within data. The analysis consists of 6 stages, which are cyclical in nature in order to enable a thoroughly refined set of results. The in vivo software was used as an analysis tool, and the most frequently mentioned auto-generated codes were the words traveler, community, and group. So, in the results, there were 3 main themes evident from the thematic analysis, which I have illustrated in a process model in the next slide. But the 3 main themes were traveler legitimacy, group advocacy, and collective action, and each of those themes had sub-themes that totaled 7. Also, when developing a full process model, it was evident that there were 2 mechanisms that were common between all the themes linking them. It was necessary to also include the macro and cultural influences within the process model that were clearly underlying factors affecting the analysed themes. This is the full process model of these relationships that are illustrated. However, I will show this model again once I've gone into more detail into the other themes. The first main theme, which comprises of 2 sub-themes, describes the struggles and discrimination that Irish travellers uniquely experience in Ireland. These struggles include proving oneself and the settlers' discomfort and denial of traveller discrimination. So the first sub-theme was labelled Proving Oneself. A participant who self-identified as an Irish traveller spoke about their daily experience living in Ireland and within Irish settler settings. As an Irish traveller, they would often have to prove to others that they were responsible and could be trustworthy and reliable. And on the screen now is a quote that describes that point. In the next sub-theme, it was labelled Proximity. There's a lot of discussion about Irish traveller discrimination in the Irish context and how it is treated differently to other types of discrimination. The discomfort that Irish settled people seem to have about discussing various marginalised groups was noted within a proximity context of how social changes would directly impact upon themselves. And there is a quote on the screen now related to that point. Legitimising traveller discrimination is more difficult for Irish settled people to do because it depends on Irish settled people taking ownership for this discrimination. It is something which was created and fostered in Ireland by Irish settlers, and it is impossible to acknowledge without also accepting responsibility. And so this point was also related to the proximity effect relating to the legitimacy of Irish traveller discrimination. And the quote is on the screen. The second main theme was group advocacy, and this theme is divided into 2 main sub-themes that represent a maladaptive and an adaptive outlet of group advocacy approaches. Group advocacy was a central role within the many roles of the organisation that was discussed during the interview, and these 2 distinct expressions of group advocacy were predominantly discussed within the context of the ecosystem ecology, where the organisation would have to advocate for the needs of the communities that they represent. So the first sub-theme, the hierarchy of oppression, refers to when participants described what they would often notice would happen when there was an opportunity for different marginalised groups to request the aid and support that they needed from the Irish government. And they argue that this maladaptive strategy is not well founded. And there is a quote there on the screen. And so in contrast to the method of advocacy previously referred to, solidarity was put forward as a more adaptive method, especially within the context of both national and international support conferences. Solidarity would shift the focus away from intergroup conflict. And so there's a quote there on the screen. And participants noted, though, that individual needs and cultural differences do not have to be affected by using a solidarity approach for group advocacy. The intention with the solidarity approach is to be effectively listened to and ensure the necessary end to institutionalised racism that affects all groups in Ireland by enacting helpful policies. And a quote there on the screen that supports that. And so this final theme, collective action, encompasses the active social changes that is wanting by the participant group. So these sub-themes reflect the recommended solutions for reducing discrimination within all ecological systems. So these sub-themes were representation, partnership, and empowerment. And the quotes on the following slides sum up the sub-themes quite effectively. So we have representation, partnership, and empowerment. Throughout analysis, it became clear that there were common factors that linked these themes together. These factors are evident within each theme and seem to relate to the themes as mechanisms that connect traveller legitimacy, group advocacy, and collective action. And there were two significant mechanisms that had to be included within the analysis. These were labelled as emotion and sustainability. Now, the emotion mechanism appeared to have both positive and negative loops, which could act as barriers or facilitators within each theme. And the positive loop could be labelled as trust, and the negative emotion loop that would act as barriers to the organisation's success is frustration. Frustration was a common linking factor between all themes that would impede growth and progress. And there's a quote there associated with that. The other mechanism, sustainability, was a common underlying factor that related to community development and capacity building. And without sustainability, lasting social change cannot happen. And there is a quote there relating to that. And so lastly, there were clear cultural influences that would also affect the main themes outlined in this analysis. And these macro influences can be summarized as intercultural competence. Intercultural competence would include cultural stereotypes and cultural discrimination and racism within Irish society. And so there was a quote relating to that. Now, this is a process model again, now that I have explained through the themes in more detail, and you can see how the mechanism and cultural influences relate with the three main themes in the model. So in conclusion, Irish traveller discrimination is an existing form of discrimination within a unique Irish context. Group advocacy can either be adaptive or maladaptive, and it is currently more commonly maladaptive, according to the focus group. There must be valid representation, partnership, and empowerment evident within any processes. Mechanisms such as emotion has both positive and negative loops that can have significant effects on social activism. Sustainability is key because without this, projects will fail before they have been implemented. And it is important to recognise the influence of intercultural competence when designing methods of enacting social change. So thank you everyone for listening to my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference.